next, addressing participants of a conference held by the American Society of Newspaper Editors, is former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He discusses changes in the communist world.
How to introduce our next guest is a daunting task. At a Washington cocktail party to hail a newly published book that was titled simply Kissinger, someone asked the subject if he had yet read the volume. No, came the reply, but I liked the title. In the same vein, when President Nixon announced he was making our guest his Secretary of State, a TV correspondent asked the appointee how he'd like to be addressed. Do you prefer being called Mr. Secretary or Dr. Secretary? I don't stand on protocol, the new cabinet officer responded. It will be okay if you just call me Excellency. And so it has gone throughout his career, a larger-than-life figure whose dimensions defy ordinary description. In a single paragraph, on one page, in one chapter of a book about him, the author employed the following descriptive adjectives attempting to get a handle on the man: witty, disarming, clever, shrewd, cunning, astute, hard-working, articulate, profound, debonair, gregarious, a little boy, devious, secretive, volcanic, tempestuous, impatient, loquacious, tyrannical, insecure, and finally the exasperated author summed up: the smartest statesman I have ever met. Henry Alfred Kissinger has cast a long shadow across the foreign policy of this, his adopted land, for more than a quarter of a century. As academician, national security advisor, our 56th Secretary of State, consular to presidents, Nobel Prize winner, and at the apogee of this distinguished recitation, author of a syndicated newspaper column. He has seeded several generations of National Security Council and State Department staffs with his pupils, a list currently headed by Brent Scowcroft. And indeed, one hears whispers in this town that he wouldn't mind once again being back on the field as, in that favorite sports writing cliche, a marquee player. He may even be willing to forswear broccoli. But certainly, as the remarkable events in the communist bloc have unfolded in recent months, Mr. Kissinger has emerged as something of a prophet in his own time, without the hair shirt, to be sure. As a matter of fact, speaking before this very forum in 1980, reviewing U.S.-Soviet relations, he said we faced a period of maximum danger for 5 years, and then he boldly predicted, and I quote, the certainty is that Soviet domestic problems will mount. With the benefit of hindsight, that's not bad handicapping, even for an editorial page columnist. 10 years later, Mr. Kissinger will now launch us into the 90s decade of diplomacy with another crystal ball look. Unfinished business, changes in the communist world. In the egalitarian world of ASNE, he will forgive me for skipping the excellency, but nonetheless take great pleasure in welcoming to our midst a distinguished citizen, Henry Kissinger.
Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, when I heard that one-page description, I thought that it had precision, which I have come to admire in the journalistic profession. That man couldn't be wrong, no matter what I did. I've been asked to speak about 20 minutes on changes in the communist world and leave the rest of the time for questions. If I do, You can all say you were present at a historic occasion. In fact, my native language being German, I've sometimes gone for 20 minutes without placing a verb. As the editor of my column will tell you. About my column, I can only say two things. One, I asked Tony Day this morning whether he had any particular suggestion of what I might talk about, and he said, be clear, which is something I've never achieved in a first draft. And a few weeks ago, Bill Sapphire wrote me about a column that I had written, and he said, it had only one subject, which is a record for you. Anyway, let me talk about changes in the communist world, and let me give you briefly my analysis of what I think has been happening, some of the implications for American foreign policy, and then take a few of your questions. The general discussion about changes in the Soviet world starts from the premise that the communist world is now heading towards pluralistic democracy and towards market economics, that in turn will change the nature of international relations. The most frequently asked question of me when I speak around the country is, will Gorbachev survive? And I always evoke shock when I say that is not my principal concern. Because my view is that if it were in fact true that all these changes are entirely due to one personality, then we are indeed in deep trouble. And these changes are meaningful only if they reflect some underlying realities that any Soviet leader would have to deal with. This would still give Gorbachev an enormous amount of credit for the panache with which he has handled it, for the courage with which he's tackled the problem, and for the willingness to face the consequences of some of his conclusions. But it also suggests that other Soviet leaders might have to come to the same general conclusions, and it means that American foreign policy should focus on the underlying factors rather than on the personality, and put a somewhat lower priority on of a national objective on whether the survival of Gorbachev in office should be the principal national objective of the United States. Not that I have the highest regard for him. Now let me state briefly what I take to be the underlying factors that have produced these changes, and many of them have been covered in excruciating length. Everybody knows the dilemmas of the Soviet economy. No centrally planned economy, however, has ever moved towards market conditions, partly because so many vested interests develop under a combination of central planning and communist domination that it has proved almost impossible to break through the crust of privilege that is established as a result of it. Gorbachev's major insight in this connection has been the willingness to face the fact that a move towards the central planning mechanism cannot be fixed. He started out trying to fix it and has recognized that the economy cannot be improved by fixing the central planning mechanism. Secondly, that the Communist Party is the biggest obstacle to reform, and that he has been prepared to answer the question which has bedeviled all other communist states of what do you do with a Communist Party in a communist state. The Communist Party is an instrument for seizing power. It is not an instrument for governing, at least not over an extended period of time if you want to make progress. I look at Gorbachev's political reforms not as a device to establish pluralistic democracy, but as a means of breaking the preeminence of the Communist Party. perhaps over a period of decades, it will move, or years, it will move towards a pluralistic system. But that, I do not believe, is his primary objective. His primary objective is to create an alternative system of legitimacy to the Communist Party. To move from central planning mechanisms to market economics can only be accomplished through a period of great difficulty and suffering. And yet, the communist system deprives their leaders of precisely the legitimacy they need in order to impose the sacrifices. The first generation of communist leaders can claim that the successful revolution demonstrates the fact that they have public support. But after they've been in power for 60 years, and every succeeding power struggle has been terminated with the disgrace of the defeated, while the public didn't even know a power struggle was going on until the defeated had been disgraced. A situation arises in which there are neither heroes nor real continuity. No Soviet leader has ever retired with honor. Indeed, no Soviet leader has ever retired. No Soviet leader has ever survived his own death. Last year, when I was in the Soviet Union and met with Gorbachev, there was a little item in the newspapers, and in the evening, a member of the nomenclatura said to me, "The man you've seen today has asserted that every leader we have had since Lenin has been either a criminal or a fool." It was true. That's what he has asserted. Now, in this situation, it is extremely difficult to exact the sacrifices that are needed to move towards the economic reform, without which the Soviet Union will become perhaps the most developed of the underdeveloped countries. This Gorbachev has achieved, but in a strange way. He has started an electoral procedure about which I think one can say what Lord Palmerston said about the Schleswig-Holstein question in the 19th century. He said only 3 people had ever understood it. One is dead, the second is in a lunatic asylum, and he was the third, and he had forgotten it. But essentially the procedure is that every organization has a right to vote in some manner. A system that is well designed to undermine the existing national institution, namely the Communist Party, but makes it very difficult for an alternative national structure to emerge. And in fact, as a result of glasnost, no national democratic pluralistic institution has in fact emerged. And so Gorbachev confronts a Supreme Soviet that is high on criticism, but has not been able to form any coherent alternative program to the one that he has proposed. Now, that can happen over a period of years, and in a national state, it might well happen. It is inhibited in the Soviet Union, in addition, by the fact that the Soviet Union is not a national state, but an empire. Such democratic institutions as have developed have concentrated on the republics, where both the Communist Party and the alternative parties do in fact reflect public sentiments, but public sentiments that are hostile to centralization in Moscow, and in fact, in many cases, hostile to Moscow altogether. So that the Soviet Union, as a result, the changes in the communist world have, in the Soviet world, have produced a political system which at this point has moved from legally or constitutionally from one-party rule to one-man rule at the center to a kind of pluralism at the periphery, and to a pluralism among the various republics in which a nationalist sentiment is developing in most of the republics, including in the Russian Republic. The Russian Empire, unlike many of the European empires, has not managed to develop a leadership group in its subject people that feels that they must adopt the Soviet model as an example. And the huge majority of popular leaders that have emerged in the republics have been hostile not just to centralization in Moscow, but to Soviet rule. So this is the fundamental problem that the Soviet Union has. In Eastern Europe, the problem is quite different. They are not even the first generation of leaders could claim legitimacy because, except for Yugoslavia, they were all imposed by Soviet arms. There too, it turned out that communist parties are really not designed, at least in the first instance, for democratic contests. And the ease with which they were overthrown once the protection of the Soviet army was removed and the legitimacy for using the secret police disappeared has really been startling. In Eastern Europe, depending on the national tradition, it is possible, one can conceive the emergence of pluralistic institutions easily in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, to a lesser extent, but still significantly in Poland. East Germany will be absorbed in the West German political system, and Romania and Bulgaria I consider major question marks. But let me raise now a few questions of what it means for American foreign policy. American foreign policy, ever since we came into contact with the Soviet Union, has oscillated between two extremes. On the one hand, they believe that we were dealing with evil incarnate and that therefore any negotiation was to make a pact with the devil. Or else, a nostalgia that at some magic moment conversion would take place, that the Soviet Union would become like we are, that some leader would appear who, professing American values, or at least adhering essentially to parallel values as we, would bring the Soviet Union to the road of reason. In 1943, Senator Connolly, not known for his radical sympathies, said when Stalin abandoned the Comintern, Russians for years have been approaching the abandonment of communism, and the whole world will be gratified by this happy culmination of their efforts. In 1964, Dean Rusk said that Brezhnev had learned the incompatibility between communism and meeting the demands of his people, and that the next period would be dominated by this. This doesn't mean that similar statements today are wrong, but it means something else. It means, I do believe, as I indicated, that the communist system as an ideological system is practically finished. But I do not believe that this automatically solves all our foreign policy problems. And in fact, we will face two contradictory foreign policy problems. The whole world insists that we want perestroika to succeed. And, however, if perestroika succeeds, Russia will be powerful. And 700 years of Russian history have indicated that a powerful Russia has almost invariably expanded. One can argue indefinitely of why this is, whether it is the flat terrain, the frequent invasions from abroad, the difficulty of believing that anybody in the world wanted to be like Russia, and therefore one had to, could be secure only by physical domination. Whatever the reason is, history shows an almost inexorable expansion. Russian armies from the time of Peter the Great were at to the beginning of World War I, were at the gates of Berlin and Paris and Budapest, in Adrianople, all over Manchuria, at the gates of India. Now, if a nation has done something for 700 years, you cannot say that it can never change, but it would indicate a certain proclivity that one cannot assume necessarily can be ended by one man. The other hand, if that should again be the Russian policy, it would certainly be different from the time that it was backed up by ideological fervor and when there were communist parties in all countries that were really partly or largely directed from Moscow. But the other possibility is that the Soviet Empire will disintegrate. And if you look at what is happening in the various republics, the possibility must be faced that it is quite conceivable that these various, some of these republics will achieve independence, that this will then acquire a certain momentum. You could say, of course, maybe it can be confined to the Baltics, but whatever, if it achieves a certain momentum, the United States will be faced with an endless series of dilemmas as we are facing now on Lithuania, and avoided on Azerbaijan, which, however, had similar characteristics, and will be facing in the predictable future if it goes in that direction. And I would argue that the United States is not really very well equipped to deal with either of the possible contingencies. The contingency we are best equipped to deal with, namely a pluralistic Soviet Union developing a market economy and integrating itself into an OECD world, is, in my view, the least likely outcome, much as we would all wish it. One reason we're not too well prepared for it is because we have had a spectacular success in the foreign policy of the last 45 years. Whether we've had it or whether it happened because of the internal weakness of the Soviet system or for any combination of reasons, doesn't really matter. But if one compares what was said in the beginning of the containment period by Kennan, by Atchison, by Dulles, with what occurred at the end, it is very rare that a nation achieves its wishes so completely. And we tend to interpret this as meaning that if you believe firmly enough in your goals, in some magic way, there's the fitness of the universe that will bring them about. And our convictions did correspond to at least some of the realities of that period. There was a menace. There was a huge gap between expectation and reality. All the things that Americans do well, ideological conflict, struggle between good and evil, economic recovery, sort of applied to at least a considerable part of the post-war period. But now the world that we see emerging has not necessarily these characteristics. I have said the Soviet Union has been expanding, or Russia has been expanding for 700 years. And assume perestroika succeeds, and assume they'll become strong, and assume they'll become more assertive. What then is the danger? How precisely are we going to deal with it? What is it we're trying to avoid? And what do we do now to avoid it? Everything in the 40s and 50s was sold with the proposition that there was a terminal day to our efforts, and that some sort of end was then achieved. There is no end foreseeable in the world that I'm describing. There will be, if perestroika succeeds, some sort of Russian danger. What sort of Russian danger? Conventional, nuclear. We need to analyze it. We keep saying we want to preserve NATO. I keep hearing it. I've said it myself. That's probably where I heard it. And there are many reasons for it, including that it gives the Europeans, the West Europeans, some reassurance against any possible fear of Germany. But how do you keep NATO together? Against what threat? What is the purpose of a military alliance for which you can't define a military strategy? For what, where do we keep troops? And for what purpose and in what numbers? I'm not saying that I have an answer to all these questions, so if you'd given me more time, there's no telling what enlightenment you might have received from me. But how do we bring arms control into relation to to the political map that is now emerging. Arms control, for as long as it has existed, has been based on a dividing line in Europe, through the center of Europe, and with equal numbers on, or more or less equal numbers on both sides. 2 years ago, equal numbers on both sides would have been considered a spectacular achievement when we were confronting what we thought was the huge superiority of the Soviet army. Today, where is the dividing line? Where do you calculate the equal numbers? Do you create a legitimacy for the presence of Soviet troops that they couldn't achieve except through arms control? Are we going to wind up with Germany in NATO, which is part of our proposal, and with Russian troops on NATO territory in East Germany, which is part of another set of schemes that is also being floated by NATO nations? I'm in favor of Germany in NATO for a variety of reasons. I'm just saying we do not have a clear concept right now, and probably cannot have, of where we are going. And we are also living probably in the most euphoric period we are going to see. The peoples of Eastern Europe want market economics and pluralistic democracy, in part because, at least subconsciously, they think that will get them to West European standards. And it will, and it may, and it will probably over a period of time. But Western Europe went through 10 years of suffering before it got there. And 2-3 years from now, things in Eastern Europe will look much more complicated. And will America then, and how do we maintain our interest in the slogging process rather than in the euphoric process? Now, I've now just talked about European communism, and very briefly. The world which we've been describing to ourselves is a world now of really many power centers, a European community, a Soviet Union, certainly Japan, probably China, perhaps India. How does the United States conduct itself in a world of many power centers, which has no permanent enemy and no inevitable reconstruction project to which we can dedicate medium-term idealism? What is the American foreign policy concept on which we operate? On the one hand, we have a great missionary zeal. I notice that many of the people who 20 years ago were arguing against military overcommitment in Indochina are now arguing for what may be moral overcommitment by accepting the principle that we have a duty to change every government around the world, or at least to promote it. How? Do we know how? Do we have the means? Do we know the relationship between ends and means? This is the big challenge that we now face. We haven't had an X article for the new period. We don't have a clear-cut concept of how we would operate a multipolar world. As a historian, I would say, in general, peace has occurred either through domination or through equilibrium. But the American Wilsonian dream is that it comes about through collective security, through all nations altruistically looking at the international situation, making their decisions on the basis of the intrinsic merit of the issue, and judging it on that basis. When I first came to Washington as a consultant in the Kennedy administration, there was a Berlin crisis. And many of my colleagues from Harvard were determined that we were going to get Nehru's support. And they thought that there was some policy out there which, if we could only phrase it properly, would get the support of the non-committed. And I was the skunk at the garden party. I kept saying there is no rational reason why India would ever support an American position on a city 3,000 miles away in which India has no historical connection when the Soviet Union is just one country away and they have so many other problems at their borders. I'm not saying this in order to indicate who was right or who was wrong, and maybe it indicates limited moral horizons on my part. I'm simply saying that it is a different challenge from the one we have historically faced, and a different challenge from any we have faced in this century, where our commitments have always been evoked by overwhelming danger, moral evil, huge suffering, anything, however, that had some sort of a terminal date. Or take the other hypothesis. Supposing the Soviet Union disintegrates, and all kinds of struggles develop, especially at the southern rim. How do we define the American national interest? What is it that we should get ourselves involved in? How do we want it to come out? What can we do? How do Middle Eastern developments affect developments, especially on the southern rim of the Soviet Union? And I'm not saying this because I would welcome the disintegration of the Soviet Union. On the whole, I think it would have enormous international destabilizing effects. But my major point is that in the end, we can't affect it. In the end, we are a marginal player in the actual disintegration. And frankly, I think we're a marginal player in whether Gorbachev survives or not. So what I want to leave you with is that fundamentally my view is not that I have the answer, but that the real debate in this country now should concern what is an American national interest, most generously conceived. How do we vindicate notions of world order, world peace? How do we relate our moral convictions to our capabilities? The sort of problem that the other nations have faced. In the 1930s, Winston Churchill wrote a long essay about the operation of the balance of power, and he went through all the countries that Britain had opposed and had supported. He said, don't accuse me of being pro-French and anti-German. If circumstances were reversed, I would be pro-German and anti-French. We cannot pursue a policy based on sentiments. We have to pursue, we have to develop a law of public policy whereby we can preserve the liberties of Europe. Now, I'm not saying that those conditions exactly apply to the United States. I'm saying, though, that some of the questions I put need an answer. I'm not accusing anybody for not having answered them, because we have had a stunning success. I think the administration has handled the tactics of it with great prudence, and it's much too early for them to have come up with an embracing approach. But in the next phase of foreign policy, the changes in the communist world will impose on us a requirement to deal at least with some of the issues that I've raised. And of course, I've talked longer than 20 minutes, but I will now be happy to take some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Will you please identify yourself and the name of your paper? Questions are confined to members of the society only.
I'm Joe Stern of the Baltimore Sun. Mr. Secretary, the Russians have been obsessed with the German threat much longer than they've been obsessed with the American challenge. Now that we have German reunification developing very quickly, how is this changing internal and external policies in the Soviet Union as you see it?
I think that that it will be interesting to see how the Soviets react. There are two strands in both German and Soviet policy. One is to use the other to enhance their position, and the other is to be afraid of the other. My view is that if the Soviets seriously push German neutrality, it can only be for the reason that they hope that that they want to maintain the future option of some kind of cooperation with Germany for the domination of Eurasia, or at any rate for using the Germans to build them up and then controlling the Germans with their nuclear superiority, something like that. On the other hand, I could also conceive that the Soviet Union is afraid, and genuinely afraid, of what might happen as not this generation of German leaders unifies Germany, but what the future generations of German leaders would do. And I think that they are entitled to a serious conceptual discussion of how one protects them against their historic fear of invasion from the West. And I think that should really be, at this stage, the subject of arms control negotiations, much more than balancing simply balancing the numbers, because we could wind up with having a NATO policy going in one direction, an arms control policy based on historical precedents on another. I think there have been a number of schemes proposed, including by me, that I think might reassure the Soviets on their historic fears. But it's a tricky problem, and it's not something in which one can simply assure doesn't exist.
Could we go over to the side?
Yes, sir.
Tom Tooley with the Courier in Evansville, Indiana. Mr. Kissinger, you have occupied the Secretary's chair and have been in a position to observe other occupants of that chair over the past 3 decades. Given that background, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the current occupant of that chair, Mr. Baker?
That's the sort of question that it's designed to generate endless controversy. I've stated my view of the administration policy. I think it's been prudent and intelligent in dealing with the tactics of the situation. It has not come up with the definition of the objectives towards which this process is supposed to lead. But it's also too early, and therefore that ultimate judgment would have to wait for a while.
Michael McGough from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. 2 questions about Lithuania. The first is whether, based on your experience at the time, the Soviets have any reason to expect us to be restrained where the Baltic states are concerned, notwithstanding the congressional reservation at the time of the Helsinki Agreement and the fact that we refused to recognize the incorporation legally, whether they have a reason to believe that we have acquiesced in this over the years and that we have a sort of obligation on that score. And the second question is whether, if we were to do what some people are counseling, which is to recognize in a very speedy way the new government of Lithuania as an independent government, whether that has any dangers or whether we are, in your words, so marginal a player that it wouldn't make any difference anyway.
With respect to the first question, if you ask, am I aware of any secret understandings in which we, in effect, wrote off the Baltic states to the Soviets, I'm not aware of any, and through all the period that I was in government, and through most of the, I would think all of the period until this summer, American secretaries of state and their colleagues were concerned with freeing Eastern Europe, and that seemed such a tall and improbable order that one didn't think one would reach the issue of the Baltics until so far down the road that there was no need to do any more than to state the general principle of non-recognition. I don't remember any discussion where anyone thought that what has happened lately would happen in the lifetime of any of the participants in those discussions. Now, what would be the impact of a more forward American policy? Well, one can argue at the margins I think it's probably not a good idea that first 3 days of a week we say we're warning the Soviets and then say now we are stopping the warning. But those are tactical issues. The question at the margins is, could one have raised the admissions price higher? And that can be debated forever. But at the end of the day, what I think the President and the Secretary of State will have to decide is precisely the sort of issue that I was discussing earlier. What priorities do you establish? And I cannot find it in my heart to blame them for saying, if that's what they think, that the first priority must be to get the Soviets out of Central Europe. And we must not confuse that with a showdown on something that the Soviets consider their national territory, much as we sympathize with the aspirations of Lithuania. And I think it is the sort of dilemma in which we are bound to find ourselves in the next years as the situation evolves that I described. And one should not give simple-minded answers to that and give the impression that some great declaration can end it, because while I do not believe that one needs to worry about the overthrow of Gorbachev as a principal goal of American policy, one does not want to create the impression that it is our objective to disintegrate the Soviet Union. Our objective is to permit self-determination. We can't keep it together for them. But there is a fine line between our not cooperating and keeping it together and our actively undermining it. And this is one that requires a sensitive judgment. Yes, sir.
Watson Sims, New Brunswick, New Jersey Home News. Mr. Secretary, if Gorbachev's central purpose was to end the dominance of the Communist Party and create an alternative system, was this purely a matter of self-preservation, or did he have broader motives? Would you speculate as to what his motivation must have been?
I have not been able to make up my mind whether Gorbachev is a great statesman or the best runner on a log we have seen, and I'm not sure that he really knows. He clearly started out thinking that he could operate within the existing system. All his early moves were in the direction of improving the existing system. He apparently has learned through trial and error that cannot work. And so it has surely a large element of self-preservation, and he has clearly created a structure in which, with breathtaking skill, he has deprived his opponents of a national basis. Now the query is, you can get into power and even stay in power that way, but can you bring about a big change that a large part of your population opposes for various reasons if you do not have a group of people around you and spread around the country that have a positive orientation? And I think, to me, it looks as if he has been more skillful in the first of these objectives than in the second, but I will grant him, I mean, if he were here and said to me, look, before I can get to the second, I had to do the first, I would say that there's a lot of merit in that.
Well, here, if I can follow up for a moment. Is he either a lunatic or a criminal or a Russian patriot? How would you classify him?
Oh, he's not a lunatic and he's not a criminal, and he is almost certainly, I think he's a Russian patriot. But this creates another set of problems for him, because I would think that part of the reason for his action in Lithuania is that for the Russians, for the Russian part of his country, which is half of the population, to give up everything that they have suffered for in hundreds of years is a very painful pill. And so he cannot wind up in a position, he can barely give up Eastern Europe because that can be blamed on foreigners. But when the empire itself starts disintegrating without resistance from the center, I think he could be thinking that he'd be losing his Russian national constituency. And I believe that that is a major factor in his action. painful as on human grounds I find his action.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mel Opatowski from the Press Enterprise in Riverside, California. Considering your personal background as well as your expertise, do you harbor any serious concerns, any apprehensions about a united Germany?
You know, I keep repeating a phrase that I've been using so much that even I don't consider it amusing anymore, but I'll repeat it once more. I have said repeatedly on national television that if Germany had not been unified in my lifetime, I would not have died unfulfilled. So it is not that I passionately felt the need for unification. I did believe, however, that when the wall came down, unification was inevitable. There has never been any reason for the existence of the East German state other than as a Soviet and communist outpost. And once that disappeared, I took it for granted that unification should occur rapidly. I now believe that the more rapidly unification is achieved, the more likely Germany is to remain as part of some Western system. While the more it is prolonged, the more we are going to encourage people to multiply conditions, and the more we are going to tempt the Germans to seek equidistance from these conditions. So whatever my background and whatever my emotions might have been on that subject a year or two ago, I now feel that for the sake of all of us, this is the generally best course to follow. That is rapid unification and fostering German ties to the West. But then one has to find a security system that meets the Soviet concerns that we discussed earlier. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, I'm Alan Horton from the Naples, Florida Daily News. Now that the Soviets are preoccupied with everything we've just been discussing, what happens to Castro in Cuba?
I think Castro has become an anachronism of no major concern, should be of no major concern to us in the Western Hemisphere in terms of his influence. Whether he will be overthrown as Ceausescu was, or whether the system will weaken after he dies, that depends on local circumstances about which I don't know enough. But I think he is no longer a major player on the international scene.
Our den mother said we have 5 more minutes.
Herb?
Come on.
I used to be Herb Klein, Henry. Henry, I'd like very much to hear your analysis of what we should be doing regarding China in view of what's happened in the Soviet Union, in view of the discussion we've had here, but with Mongolia also thrown into it, that's a major
You'd like me to commit suicide. You know, I have evoked passionate assaults on myself and on my motives in my views on China. My view on China is heavily influenced by what I said earlier. I consider China a major factor in the international equation. It doesn't mean I liked what went on at Tiananmen Square, but here are 1,200,000,000 people who have governed themselves for 4,000 years without conspicuous assistance from the United States, and who I would prefer not to move into a xenophobic mood in terms of a history in which foreign intervention has not always been considered such a blessed event. I also believe that if Chinese economic reform were to continue, that more pluralistic, if not democratic, institutions would evolve over a period of time. So I think we are at the edge of what can combine various objectives. The existing sanctions indicate our general attitude and may create some pressures inside China in the direction of of reform. I'm very disappointed in the Chinese attitude towards the dissident in the American embassy. I think that our concerns there should have received a greater recognition than they have, or than I thought they had when I was there. But on the whole, I do not think we should drive the issue to a confrontation with China in the light of the uncertainties of what might develop in the Soviet Union and in the light of the of our relationship with Japan, which might lose respect for our capacity to manage the political environment. And I know this is a highly unpopular point of view, but I consider the long-term national security interest of the United States also a moral value.
Thank you.
Mr. Kissinger, this society is in your debt, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Mr. Medina,
April is
I had
National
occasion
Cable
to
Month,
visit
each night featuring a different cable network.